That's perfect. Go ahead. Thank
Great,
you.
excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. It's really an honor to share the panel with all these wonderful speakers and interesting ideas. So I am Moin Syed from the University of Minnesota in the US. And my topic today is stop talking about diversity in open science. Now, to dispel any misunderstandings, the title of my talk is most certainly clickbait. I don't actually want people to stop talking about diversity in open science. What I want is for conversations on diversity in open science to move beyond where they have generally been. I put diversity in quotes because that is a in quotes because using it as a catch-all term is what I want us to stop doing. This talk is really a plea for specificity in our communication. It builds directly on the themes from the previous talks. It was really nice. I'm glad my talk wasn't pre-recorded because I can actually refer to some of the ideas that people mentioned earlier, because it really does build upon many of the themes, but kind of puts them in a little bit of a different framework or way of thinking. So there have been numerous conversations at conferences and online about diversity issues in the open science movement. These discussions are framed as being concerned with diversity, but diversity is broad, multidimensional concept. To me, a session on diversity in open science is akin to a session on statistics in open science. Such a broad frame leads to diffuse discussions and inaction. So I really think we need more specificity in what we mean by diversity to guide directions for action. This talk draws from a chapter I wrote with Uma Katawala. In that chapter, we focus not only on the needed specificity of diversity and open science, but the mutual relationship between cultural psychology, diversity-related research, and open science principles and practices. So if you're interested, you can read that chapter. For this talk, I'm just highlighting the need for specificity when talking about diversity. So it's a little bit less on the connection to open science. So I'll get that to the end, but really focusing on how do we think about diversity really in any context, but in particular in the context of open science. Importantly, my examples and frame of reference draws from psychology and primarily from US-based psychology, but the general points are relevant to any discipline or cultural context, even if the specifics will differ. I also want to note that I gave a shorter version of this talk at the Society for Improvement of Psychological Science pre-conference of the 2020 meeting of the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, which is not notable other than it was the last large gathering I attended almost exactly 1 year ago. Okay, so getting into the meat of things, the term diversity means so much that it essentially means nothing. It's a vague term that can pertain to just about any form of human variation. So race, ethnicity, gender, immigrant status, geographic region, ideological views, whatever. But that does not actually matter so much for the main points I'm putting forward today, as the disaggregation that I want to outline today works for pretty much any definition of diversity. Rather, I'm arguing that we should break down our analysis of diversity into 3 distinct dimensions. I'm not arguing that this breakdown is the only way to think about diversity or that there are not other ways to think about the complexities of this issue. Indeed, I think we've seen from a variety of the other talks this morning, especially Sandy's and Leslie's, there are a variety of ways to think about diversity issues in open science. But separating these 3 is at least a useful starting point to drawing attention to some of the issues that we should be focusing on. First, we have diversity of researchers, or the diversity of the scientists actually doing the research. This is the dimension that has been a heavy focus of online and conference discussions, specifically whether the open science community is an inclusive and welcoming place for individuals who identify with marginalized groups. So the focus on climate, inclusivity, access, things of that nature is about who is doing the work, the diversity of the researchers themselves. A very important dimension of diversity with respect to open science, but not the totality of what we need to be thinking about. Second, we have diversity of samples. Now, the lack of diversity in research samples has been robustly documented for many, many years. When discussing this dimension, you will often see references to the weird people problem. Although everyone loves a good acronym, ironically, the weird label itself is exclusionary. It says nothing of race and ethnicity, nor any other dimension, or sorry, not many other dimensions of diversity. Additionally, it's a backronym, an acronym created first, essentially, to capture different dimensions. I really wish we would to stop using it, but alas, that is likely a losing battle, but it's one I will continue to wage. Anyway, rather than focus on who is doing the research, the issue here is focused on who our research is conducted with. What populations inform our theoretical and empirical knowledge base? Now, again, as I mentioned, I'm drawing primarily from psychology and social science research when thinking about these issues, but it really can generalize to any field. Any type of samples that you're taking or materials that you're working with, you can think about the diversity of those materials, the diversity of those samples, whether it's human subjects or some other kinds of sample. Okay, so diversity of researchers and diversity of samples, that's pretty obvious, pretty familiar to most of you who are watching this. The third dimension gets a lot less attention, which is diversity of perspectives. Now, I'm not talking about what some people refer to ideological diversity or viewpoint diversity, but that can be subsumed within here. And you've heard a little bit about diversity of perspectives from Maddie's talk on feminist perspectives on open science, and Leslie and Sandy. This dimension pertains to the way in which researchers think about their diverse samples, how they conceptualize the diversity that's before them, often in unconscious ways. So I'll give one example of a way to sort of disaggregate these perspectives. Again, this is not the only, it's not totality of sets of different perspectives people can have. But one way in which these perspectives are important to think about. There's a classic paper by Annemarie Kause and colleagues that outline 3 cultural models that underlie any group comparative design. Their focus was on ethnic groups, but the models work for pretty much any social group. So anytime you're comparing different social groups on some outcome variable or some process or experience, there are 3 underlying models that inform that perspective. First is the cultural deviance model. And in this model, one group, typically the majority group, is set as the standard or the default group to which other groups are compared. Any deviation from the default group is considered to be a deficiency of the group, which is why such comparative approaches are often called deficit models. This has been discussed quite a bit in psychological research on ethnic racial identity or variations by race and ethnicity, where white, male, middle class participants are held as the standard, and then any comparative group of someone who's not part of that group is seen as a deviation from that standard, and so seen as a deficit from this standard that was set. So this is the cultural deviance model. In contrast, the cultural equivalence model rejects the assumption that one group is the default or normative standard and assumes that any observed group differences are located within social structural conditions. Accordingly, if not for those conditions, then the groups could be equal. So a common methodological approach within this model is to statistically control for social class when making racial ethnic group comparisons. This is done to ostensibly make the groups equivalent to remove the confound of social class. You'll often see this if anyone observes sort of some race ethnicity differences in some kind of outcome, the argument that it's not really race, it's class, right? That class is what explains those differences. This is really coming from that cultural equivalence model. However, this model assumes that social class has the same meaning across racial ethnic groups, an assumption that has been demonstrated to be false. So work by Black psychologists in the US have demonstrated that, for example, the experience of being middle class looks differently for Black Americans than it does for white Americans. It means different things. You can't just statistically control for it and then make those racial differences, quote unquote, pure. Finally, the third model is the cultural variations model, and this is one that's free of assumptions about normative standards or the nature of equality. Rather, the assumption is that there are cultural variations among groups that may be associated with both differences and similarities among groups. So there's always the potential for variations or similarities. This approach seeks to take seriously the potential role of cultural and social structural factors, but leaves room for such factors to have little or no impact on psychological phenomenon. So this diversity of perspectives is really important to understand because you can have diversity of researchers, you can have diversity of samples, but all working from the same general perspective, that the same people working with the same data have potentially different perspectives that they can bring to that interaction. As I said, There are many other ways to think about diversity of perspectives that I cannot discuss here. The presenters earlier did a really nice job talking about some of these different perspectives, but they highlight that, as I said, the same research question, you can have these very different perspectives that guide study design, measure selection, and analysis. Now, these three dimensions of diversity of researchers, samples, and perspectives are clearly related, but also not entirely dependent on each other. You can increase one of these without a concomitant increase in the other. For example, you could diversify researchers, but those researchers do not conduct work committed to diversifying samples or adopt a cultural deviance perspective that maintains the current structure. This can be especially likely when researchers are often socialized within the dominant paradigm, ways of doing things, doing science, ways of thinking, and those ways may not do anything to diversify samples and perspectives. So if you're socializing people within the existing power structure, the existing mode of doing science, as both Leslie and Sandy talked about, then you might not see changes in some of these other dimensions. Moreover, diversifying samples does not technically rely on diversifying researchers at all. This has come up in the context of researchers from the global north publishing data from samples from the global south, again, as Leslie and Sandy nicely outlined, but often not including the local researchers as authors on the publications that come from the work. I laughed because Sandy mentioned helicopter research. I was going to mention that also, this idea that researchers can swoop in, get what they need, and leave. There's an even more disparaging and controversial term that some community members and researchers use, which is drive-by research, which highlights the idea that researchers' actions can actually do damage to the communities that they work with if they're not treating them in a sensitive and collaborative and meaningful way. So these are all examples of how you can have diversified samples, but not diversified researchers. I want to pause on this point for just a moment because I think it's really important to get through. Movement on any one of these dimensions does not ensure movement on another. I am reiterating this point because I often see it so often poorly recognized. That there's this belief that, well, if we just diversify who's doing the research, then we'll have all these other benefits. Or if we diversify the samples, then we'll have these other benefits. And that's just not necessarily the case. And so it's important to pull these dimensions apart. That said, all three can and often will have reciprocal relations with one another. For example, if we look at ethnic minority researchers in psychology, they will often, although of course not always, seek to conduct research with ethnic minority populations. So you have diversity of researchers leading to diversity of samples, and you've absolutely seen this in some areas of psychology. The more research in the field that engages with diversity in its samples, potentially more likely that ethnic minorities see themselves as belonging in the field, that psychology is a field that is interested in them and their experiences, and that they should participate in the endeavor, which can then enhance recruitment and retention. Thus, there's really a reciprocal relation between diversity of researchers and diversity of samples. Relying on more diverse samples requires researchers to think more deeply about what they are doing with those samples, exposing them to new literatures and ways of thinking about their participants. And so diversity of samples can lead to diversity of perspectives. And conversely, thinking more deeply about diversity in our work may lead to diversifying our samples to conduct research that is consistent with that thinking. So as we broaden our thinking, we think about who's being included, who's part of this research process. Thus, there's a reciprocal relation between diversity of samples and diversity of perspectives. Taking up different cultural perspectives may allow us to see the field from different angles, including from an equity perspective or a structural perspective, and therefore this could lead to field-wide action that increases the diversity of researchers. And finally, increasing the number of ethnic minority researchers will likely diversify the cultural perspectives that underlie work in the field. Thus, there's a reciprocal relation between diversity of perspectives and diversity of researchers. So yes, the dimensions are all likely related, but you just remember they will not necessarily be related. But it certainly, you can think of it as a system of interrelated components, aspects of diversity that work together. Beyond that, what do you do with all of this? So in terms of engaging with initiatives that would increase diversity, those need to be targeted to each dimension. If someone is talking about one dimension and in response someone brings up another dimension without full acknowledgement that they are talking about different issues, then that is an unproductive conversation. And this is something that's really frustrated me the most about the discussions that I've seen in various forums is just really the lack of specificity and talking about different things and different interventions that would lead to different outcomes, but are all part of this broad discussion, broad conversation. And what that usually leads to is nothing happening, right? Nothing changing because everyone is sort of overwhelmed and thinking too broadly and don't have their thinking straight about what it is they're talking about. So the dimensions must be disaggregated and discussed separately. So looking at enhancing diversity of researchers relies on a serious examination of the existing ways of doing things, most centrally the power structure and the hierarchies that determine who can participate in science and what makes for good science. And again, I keep saying this, but it's true. The previous talks had all really touched upon and elaborated on the ways in which this is the case. The open science movement is indeed targeting this issue, attempting to shift away science from a model where it's an oligarchy where very few people control most of a given field to a true democracy where all participants can fully participate. Of course, that is aspirational. We are not even close to that yet, but that is at least the idea behind the movement is that we would move towards this more democratic, inclusive approach. Enhancing diversity of samples can be achieved through a variety of means. Engaging in collaboration with researchers and organizations is one route, but as I mentioned, those collaborations need to be meaningful. They cannot be helicopter or drive-by research. They need to actually be meaningful, positive collaborations. Also, being more generous with sharing data is an important step we can take to increase diversity of samples in published work. Despite the high rate of publishing generally, there is a huge amount of research waste out there. Perfectly good data that are never get used. I have tons of great data that have barely been touched because we collect so much data and there's only so much we can do with it, right? So researchers making their data openly available, especially if they work with underrepresented groups, is a good way to get more of that work out there. And then finally, with enhancing diversity of perspectives, it requires us to first recognize that we all have a perspective. Scientific inquiry is often claimed to be objective and free from such perspectives. But just because people say that does not make it so. It is absolute nonsense. We all have biases and ways of thinking about the world that impact the questions that we ask and the way we interpret findings. There's nothing natural or objective about it. We may certainly engage in practices to reduce the influence of those biases and enhance objectivity. There's nothing really wrong with that, depending on your worldview. But again, just making the claim of objectivity doesn't cut it. Actually recognizing and thinking through what our perspectives are and how they are reflected in our work is a great first step to diversifying our collective perspectives, which we desperately need. I don't really have time to get into it here. There's more details about this in the chapter, but I actually see pre-registration as an open science practice that can lead to increased diversity of perspectives. That might seem a little odd to many of you. It doesn't seem like that would be the case. And it really is for the reasons I just discussed. The biggest benefit of pre-registration that I have observed in my research group is that it makes us think more deeply. Why are we making this prediction? Why are we measuring this construct with this scale? What the heck are we doing? Right? It requires us to stop, think about what we're doing, put it down on paper, think it through, justify it, rationalize it, and that requires us to think about what our perspectives are, to be more reflective. And this kind of researcher self-reflection on the research process can really only benefit our work. Okay, so in closing, as I alluded at the beginning, each of these dimensions has different implications, problems, and solutions with respect to open science. You can read more about it in the chapter if you want, if you're interested, especially in terms of getting into specific practices and policies that would be beneficial in relation to diversity issues. But for now, please take this talk as my passionate plea to the open science community to engage in discussions and actions focused on these three dimensions rather than about diversity in total. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, thank you so much, Moin. That was really interesting. That was a really good talk. So you made really good points about the sort of importance of engaging in conversations around diversity of samples, of perspectives, of researchers. I wanted to ask if you have any views on how researchers can be incentivized to do this in the current system. So I know in the past there have been, for example, some initiatives from funders to include women in research samples as a condition of funding. And I'm wondering what your feelings are on kind of having top-down initiatives that would, you know, for example, tell researchers if you're going to do research in X country, you need to have researchers from that country part of your collaborative team.
Right. Yeah, I mean, those are really tricky questions. I'm not a huge fan of some of those particular systems because I think they really those interventions are ripe for corruption and mistreatment and problems. And so for saying you need to have a certain number of, participants from some gender or ethnicity, race in your research, yes, that will change the diversity of the samples, but that doesn't necessarily get you the diversity of perspectives, or it doesn't necessarily ensure that you diversify your research team. Like, I was clear that one can lead to the other, but not necessarily. I think, this question of how do you incentivize diversity within research comes up a lot. And I guess I tend to think of it as not incentivizing research on diversity, but de-incentivizing research that's not attending to diversity. To me, that's the more appropriate intervention. So instead of, in psychology, it's very common to do research with primarily white Americans between, the ages of 18 and 30 or 18 and 22, college students often, but then treat them as people as a whole, right? So I often say that even though in psychology we study college students a lot, we don't actually study college students as college students. We study college students as a model for all humanity. So, we treat that sample as if it can represent everybody. I think de-incentivizing that practice, so not allowing that practice anymore as journal editors, as journal reviewers, having more appropriate calibrated claims for that work that's not engaging with the diversity of the society around is probably the most beneficial intervention we can engage in. I can go on and on about this, so I'll stop, but that's what I think.
No, that was really comprehensive. Thank you. Because I think I have mixed feelings on sort of having top-down initiatives to incentivize it. Because although it would be great if researchers would do things, for the greater good or because it's the right thing to do, we do know that often that doesn't happen. So it's really interesting to hear your perspective on it.
And just to be clear, I'm not anti top-down initiatives. It's just not everything works very well top-down. And I don't know that saying you need a diverse sample is an effective top-down intervention, because that's not actually true all the time. It depends on your research question. I am very much of the mind that you need to, it's hard to believe that I would say such a thing. You need to tailor your method and your design to your research question, right? And some, you might want to just study one particular group. Well, that doesn't mean you diversify your sample because you're looking at only that group. The problem, as I said, is when you're looking at one group, but treating that one group as representative of all people.
Yeah, that was really clear. Thank you. So we got another question. How do you encourage researchers to engage with work that's critical of their frameworks, paradigms, methods, etc.?
Well, I'm very encouraging of doing that. I think it's quite necessary. I actually just wrote a blog post a week ago about this. I think there's this idea that we need to hold back criticism until, we gain more currency in the field. And I think that's really problematic. I think that's a way to maintain the dominant perspectives in the field, that we need to embrace and enhance and amplify people who are being critical. And it's usually early career researchers in particular who have the ability to be most critical because they haven't been socialized in those dominant perspectives. The issue that always comes up, of course, is the issue of retaliation and things of that nature. And that's a whole nother discussion. But I think finding, if you're an early career researcher and you're interested in engaging in some, major criticism of your field-wide practices, I encourage you to think about, and you're worried about retaliation, you can reach out to more senior folks in the field who have been critical. You know, they are out there. There are people who are out there. I'm certainly happy to help support you and work with you to help get your critical views out there. Someone who can provide you some kind of cover. I wish that wasn't that way. I don't want that to be the case. I wish it was the case that people could just be as critical and open about that as they wanted to. Some worry about the repercussions, some don't. You know, I'm of the view that we shouldn't be living in fear of people who retaliate against us. In fact, instead, that those people who engage in retaliatory behavior should be living in fear from the rest of us. That's really scientific misconduct to be engaging in that kind of behavior, and that we should be speaking out about it as best, you know, in the safest way we can, and really putting an end to that as much as possible.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I think it's time for the break now. So thanks a lot. We have I think 1 or 2 more questions in the Q&A. So if you want,
okay, I'll go in there during the break.
Yeah, feel free to answer them via the chat.
Yep.
And I'll see